I'm Simone Archer. I celebrated my 32nd birthday 2 winters ago, and for nearly all my life, I've understood my place in the family as the one coming after my older sister. My older sister, 3 years older than I am, was always the favored child. She received all the beaming looks, the compliments, the extra servings, and the nicer bedroom. Sandra never put a foot wrong, or so it seemed in the eyes of Susan and Robert Archer, my parents. She tied the knot at 25, had 2 sons by 28, made casseroles from scratch, and sent holiday cards out as early as September. As for me, I remained unattached, built my career, and rented a peaceful apartment on the other side of town where nobody questioned my single status. I managed my 401k, my Roth IRA, and intended never to rely on anyone for assistance. Evidently, achievements like mine don't really matter unless you have a wedding ring. My parents, Susan and Robert Archer, never directly said anything, but their inquiries always seemed to hold an unspoken judgment. Don't I want to raise the same old questions about having kids before the chance slips away? My sister's sons seem to be getting bigger by the day. It makes me sad that Leo and Miles don't have cousins to grow up with. You're living in that same apartment, right? I got used to just nodding and steering the conversation somewhere else. I used to believe that maybe, with enough effort, I'd eventually earn the same kind of recognition that my older sister did. But eventually the reality crept in quietly and settled over me like a layer of dust. I let myself stop seeing what sits on those shelves. I was never the daughter they talked up to their friends. I was the daughter everyone just expected would manage on my own, regardless of what happened. Even so, I didn't speak up or voice any grievances. I made it home to visit for the holidays, sorted out my parents' internet issues, and picked up a bottle of wine if they forgot anyone's birthday, including mine. And generally, I kept a comfortable gap between us. That just seemed to feel more secure to me. At the time, I had no idea that keeping my distance wouldn't actually protect me. That one day they would draw me in so close, I'd barely be able to recognize who I was. My older sister's flawless-looking world started to fracture the way delicate porcelain does, softly in the beginning, and then all at once. Her husband, Paul Kessler, had been unfaithful for several years. She stumbled upon the messages by accident. Or perhaps she had finally decided it was time to acknowledge what she had been avoiding for so long. Once she initiated divorce proceedings, nobody judged her, not even our parents, Susan Archer and Robert Archer. Paul vanished not long afterward. No child support payments, no apologies, simply gone. My older sister was left alone with Leo and Miles, her 2 sons, and a pile of bills she couldn't manage on her own. My parents were supportive in conversation, but their finances were locked away in retirement accounts and nostalgia. Sandra and my nephews moved into a small 2-bedroom place, where Leo and Miles bunked together and the wallpaper curled away from the corners. I didn't hesitate for a moment. I took care of her lawyer's retainer fee. I paid for 7 months of rent when my older sister's part-time job at the center failed to keep up with expenses. I even offered to take care of my nephews for a few weekends so that she could catch her breath. I never mentioned it afterwards or anticipated anything in return. I adored Leo and Miles. And Sandra, despite everything she'd achieved before, appeared defeated, like she wasn't accustomed to requesting help and resented needing it. Still, I found myself hoping that maybe now my parents would finally see things as they really were. Maybe this would be the moment they'd realize I wasn't the one who needed to prove myself. But they didn't. Rather, each time I spoke with my mother, the call opened with news about my older sister's struggles, and then immediately shifted to asking if I was dating anyone. I stayed silent, offered support when I could, and reminded myself that being family meant being present even when I felt overlooked. The trouble with always acting responsibly is that, eventually, everyone starts to see my help not as kindness, but as something they're entitled to. It was a Monday when my mother phoned me and said, Simone, sweetheart, we have wonderful news. Could you stop by tonight? Her voice sounded lighter than I'd heard in ages, possibly even years. For a moment, I wondered if Paul Kessler had appeared out of nowhere, if the legal system had finally tracked him down, or if my older sister's situation had finally improved. Is this about Leo and Miles Archer, or the unpaid support? I questioned. No, it's something even better, she replied. Just come over. Your father is already here, and my older sister will be here too. After work, I drove across the city feeling worn out yet intrigued. My father was settled in the recliner. My mother balanced herself right at the sofa's edge. My older sister was next to her, giving me a slightly anxious smile. A manila folder rested atop the coffee table. There she is, Robert said, rising to greet me. He hugged me, and then passed me the folder. Have a look at this. Inside, I found a thick pile of paperwork filled with dense legal terms and real estate branding. At the top was a mortgage contract. What am I looking at? I inquired. It's for Sandra's new home, my mother replied with a proud smile. We used nearly all of our savings and even tapped into some of my parents' retirement money for the initial payment. Isn't it fantastic? I blinked in surprise. You purchased a house? We did, my older sister confirmed. It's a beautiful home. 3 bedrooms, a big yard for Leo and Miles. Leo and Miles need a sense of permanence, and this apartment can't provide that. My eyes went to my older sister, who met my gaze with a faint nod but stayed silent. That's wonderful, I answered truthfully. Leo and Miles will be thrilled. As I moved to return the folder, my mother stopped me. No, that paperwork is meant for you, she insisted, pushing it back toward me. What are you saying? These are for me, I asked. My father cleared his throat. We've had some family discussions, and we've all agreed I'll be the one to take over the mortgage. I've been setting money aside for a long time, so covering the payments wouldn't be an issue for me. Sandra can't handle that cost, my mother added softly. She's trying her best, but Leo and Miles need this. An uneasy hush fell over the room, I became aware that everyone was looking at me. So I'm supposed to pay for my older sister's house? I questioned. Sandra still didn't look in my direction. After Paul moved out, I was left with nothing, she whispered. I can't provide what Leo and Miles require unless someone steps in. Again, my gaze fell on the mortgage statement. The sum was overwhelming. I've already covered the costs of her divorce, I responded in a low voice, as well as paying for 7 months of rent. I've spent the last decade saving up to buy my own house, Susan, I protested, as she took my hand. You're the ones who raised me. I've done plenty. Don't you think it's my turn to give something back? With my heart racing, I rose from my seat. You purchased a house expecting my older sister wouldn't be able to pay for it, counting on me to take care of it. My father didn't try to deny it. You have neither a spouse nor any children, he stated emotionlessly. I'm not doing this, I replied. This isn't assistance. It's controlling behavior. I left the unopened folder sitting on the table and walked out before my anger got the better of me. I believed that everyone would eventually calm down. I reassured myself that soon they would understand how ridiculous it was. Most families would never expect their unmarried daughter to pay for her older sister's house. But I had misjudged them. The first phone call arrived that Friday, and it was from my cousin Sabrina Beale, who I hadn't spoken to since my grandfather's funeral. Josie Ryder had filled her in on what transpired. Without so much as a greeting or a pause, she dove in. I can't believe how heartless you're being. Pardon me? I responded. Sandra is a single mother, Simone. Those are your nephews, Leo and Miles. You're sitting on a big pile of money and refusing to help them. I clung to the edge of the counter. Sabrina, you're not aware of everything that's happened. I know enough. Family supports its own. Before I had a chance to reply, she interjected. Sandra would do this for me too. I almost let out a sarcastic, involuntary laugh. No, she wouldn't, I murmured. I can't believe you, she snapped before hanging up. That's when the messages began. Afterward came voicemails, from acquaintances I barely remembered. Uncle Frank, Megan Porter, even a cousin I hadn't spoken to in years, all piling on. The words started to blur. You're being selfish. My parents raised you. She has kids. I don't. What stood out wasn't the anger. It was how convinced everyone sounded, as though they had no doubt I was in the wrong, and since I hadn't started my own family, I was open season to support someone else's. The harshest message arrived from Aunt Mary, my mother's oldest sister. She phoned at the start of autumn, right in the middle of dinner. I'm just trying to talk some sense into you, she said, using that syrupy voice she'd mastered. You're not getting any younger, Simone. Who knows if I'll ever have children? At least by doing this, I'd be ensuring something for my family's future. Since I'm unattached, I claimed that I somehow owed my older sister a home. I tried not to exaggerate. They could use support, and I am actually able to offer it. That same night, I went through and blocked every contact who had reached out, one after another. If they were unwilling to respect my limits, they didn't deserve access to my peace of mind. And if I was honest with myself, there was something I'd secretly realized. This had nothing to do with the house. It never did. 3 months went by. There was no word from my parents, my older sister, or anyone else I had already cut off. I threw myself into my job and took walks every morning. I let the quiet start to resemble a kind of calm. Then an envelope showed up. It came on a Tuesday, bulky and clearly official. At first I assumed it was some insurance paperwork, but my heart sank as soon as I opened it. They were taking legal action against me, Susan Archer, and Robert Archer. My parents, Susan Archer and Robert Archer, had officially initiated a civil lawsuit. They were seeking $280,000 to cover the costs associated with raising me. I went over it again and again, reading it 3 times. Every sentence felt colder and more detached than the one before. The document itemized food, clothing, and schooling. There was even a section called Emotional Support in Adolescence, which honestly made me laugh out loud. They attempted to include vacations that dated back to when I was 7. To top it off, it was clearly stated that funds had been allocated to finish paying off the mortgage for the Archer property that had been bought for my older sister and her young children. Subtlety was definitely not their strong suit. They didn't make any effort to disguise their true motives. I reached out to the most qualified attorney I could locate. Elaine Robbins agreed to see me the following day. She wore glasses, carried herself as if nothing fazed her, and listened to my entire story without showing a hint of surprise. They have no legal right to your money, Elaine asserted. I said this in a monotone while skimming the packet. Parents must provide for their underage kids. Legally, they don't have to be paid back. So then what's the point of suing me? I questioned, and Elaine simply shrugged. It's a tactic to make you uncomfortable, Elaine explained. They hope you'll settle to avoid court, or maybe they honestly feel you still owe something. My initial reaction was a sense of shock, soon followed by anger, and then a guilty discomfort about having either emotion. Throughout the next 3 months, I gathered every document I could find. I located evidence of the $8,500 I'd spent on my older sister's rent, the $6,200 check for her divorce lawyer, and past money transfers to my parents, amounts like $600 at times, $900 at others. I uncovered messages from my mother asking me for just a bit of support when my father's retirement payments hadn't been enough. I even came across receipts I didn't recall saving. I dug up old emails and printed out all the records. Each entry brought back a memory I hadn't intended to revisit. On the day of the hearing, I dressed in gray slacks and a blouse that my grandmother had given to me years before. I packed only what was necessary, and my grandparents arrived in quiet opposition to their own child. My grandmother squeezed my hand. "What they're doing isn't fair," she murmured. "But you already understand that." On the other side of the aisle, my parents were seated with my older sister next to them. My older sister refused to meet my gaze, focusing on anything else. I reminded myself to just breathe, telling myself not to expect anything. This wasn't an attempt to sway their opinions. I was here to show that my perspective still counted. The courtroom felt chillier than it should have at the start of autumn. The walls were painted an unremarkable beige, and the carpet was thin. I recall pondering who had selected the chairs. Their rigid plastic felt almost deliberately punishing to anyone waiting. My parents sat to the left, with my older sister. Between them and the row behind, aunts and uncles were gathered, people who hadn't acknowledged my birthday in ages, yet showed up now for the family's sake. There were only two on my side: my grandfather, Walter Archer, and my grandmother, Helen Archer. She wore a vintage brooch I hadn't noticed since my early years. When she bent over and gave my hand a gentle squeeze, I nearly lost control of my emotions. That was when Judge Alan Greer entered the room. He looked to be in his early 60s, with gray streaks at his temples and glasses perched low on his nose. He carried himself with a patient presence, as if nothing I could say would surprise him after a lifetime of hearing every story. My father, Robert Archer, was the first to rise. "Your Honor," he started, "we aren't unreasonable people, but we've dedicated our lives, resources, and time to caring for me. We're simply requesting a fraction of that support to assist my older sister, Sandra Archer, and her kids." Alan remained impassive. "To be precise," he said, turning a page, "how much did you contribute to her education after she was 18? My parents, Susan and Robert Archer, shared a look. My father gave a small cough before responding. "Well, during that period, my older sister had just gotten married, and we were providing support to both her and Paul Kessler, her husband, as they got established." Judge Alan Greer clarified, "You didn't help pay for Ms. Archer, my mother's college education." "No, Susan," I answered quickly, "but my grandmother, Helen Archer, did. And since she's my grandmother, I'd say we helped out indirectly." Behind me, Helen let out the most subtle scoff. Elaine Robbins remained composed and steady. "Your Honor, I have records showing that I have supported myself financially since I was 18. Furthermore, I have given ongoing monetary assistance to both my parents and my older sister." I passed the folder containing bank transactions, receipts, and emails. This included $8,500 in rent I covered for my older sister, $6,200 paid to her divorce lawyer, and various direct transfers to my parents when they reported money troubles. Judge Alan Greer examined the paperwork in silence, then lifted his gaze. "So, instead of getting financial help, the defendant was providing it. Isn't that right?" Elaine Robbins said. Susan Archer shifted where she sat. "That money isn't relevant," she objected. "We're discussing the expenses involved in maintaining her food pantry and offering emotional support." "For what reason exactly?" Judge Alan Greer inquired. "Is it necessary for me to receive $280,000 at this moment?" My mother paused, then glanced at my older sister. She whispered that it was to assist her in clearing the mortgage. There was a wordless moment. Even Uncle Frank shifted restlessly behind her. Judge Alan Greer faced my older sister next. "Archer, do you feel your sibling ought to be accountable for your housing debt?" Judge Alan Greer asked. Sandra eventually lifted her gaze. "She isn't married. She doesn't have any kids." "I do, and that brings financial responsibilities," I replied. "We are relatives." Judge Alan Greer arched an eyebrow. "I'm also unmarried. Should I cover my clerk's rent or any expenses for my bailiff's kids?" I paused, blinking, but remained silent. Judge Alan Greer then addressed my mother and father. Did you give me monetary assistance once I was an adult? We were providing help to my older sister, my father restated. So, you chose to favor one daughter instead of the other. He remarked this matter-of-factly, without any accusation. They offered no reply. Over the next hour, he pressed me with tough questions. They weren't harsh, but they never let up. Why did they expect me to cover the costs? What was the reason for buying a home when my older sister couldn't manage the payments? Why was help mixed up with guilt, and guilt equated with owing? Their responses sounded reasonable, but fell apart on closer inspection. When we made it outside, my grandmother was the first to embrace me. "You kept calm," she told me. "That's more than I can say for anyone else who was present." I still didn't know if I had come out ahead. Not at that point. Yet for the first time in ages, I wasn't being judged. The decision arrived a week after that. The courtroom seemed more cramped at the second hearing. Maybe it was because I could finally breathe in there. Judge Alan Greer kept his remarks brief. After considering all the evidence, I determined that the claim from the plaintiff lacked substance. Mr. and Mrs. Archer, the cost of caring for a child does not entitle you to reimbursement once that child becomes an adult. He looked down at the paper in front of him, then raised his eyes back to me. "Actually, the proof indicates that Ms. Archer has already contributed substantial funds to assist both you and your older sister," he continued, his tone gentle but firm. "To be honest, I consider your treatment of your daughter to be shockingly bold and upsetting." I was thrown out with no further ado. I didn't feel like rejoicing. Tears didn't come for me. I simply remained in place as Elaine Robbins beamed and my grandmother gripped my arm, while my grandfather murmured, "You're free." I thought that marked the conclusion. It turned out I was mistaken. 7 days later, my grandmother called me. "Your mother came by yesterday," she said, sounding weary. "She wanted us to give her inheritance ahead of time." "For what?" I asked, though I already understood. "To cover Sandra's mortgage," she replied. I lowered myself into a chair. How did I respond? I told her we're still unsure about how we'll divide things, and that the will falls under our responsibility to handle. Did she become upset? "No," my grandmother told me. She broke down in tears. She pleaded with us not to remove her from the inheritance. I couldn't tell what was more painful, that she made that request, or that her tears were for money rather than for me. The months that followed were uneventful and quiet. I finalized the purchase of a modest home, small, yet my own. I chose a yellow shade for the kitchen walls, set out tomato plants, and took in a gray cat who curled up next to my laptop every night. My older sister decided to lease out her home and moved back in with our parents. My mother took care of the kids while my sister was at her job. They managed to patch things together somehow. I didn't reach out by phone. I also never sent any letters. Then, nearly a year after the court case, I received an email in my inbox. There was no subject listed. It simply read, "We know you've purchased a home. Since I now have an extra room, I believe it would be helpful if my older sister Sandra and my nephews, Leo and Miles, moved in with me. Living together would make things much easier for them. Please let me know when they are able to move in. Affectionately, Susan and Robert Archer." I looked it over twice. I didn't let myself get upset. I simply wrote back, "I am not going to host Sandra or Leo and Miles. Should you reach out again with these sorts of requests, I will report your harassment to law enforcement. Do not send me another email." After that, I pressed send, blocked the address, and brewed myself some tea. Lately, my home is filled with the scents of fresh basil and coffee. My cat, a marbled gray and always solemn creature, perches by the window most mornings, watching birds he'll never pursue. I finally painted the kitchen yellow, just as I had always planned, and at last, the tomatoes out back are ripening. The house is peaceful now. No shouting voices, No uncomfortable questions. My grandmother and grandfather stop by frequently. They bring along pie or old newspaper articles they imagine I'll enjoy. My grandfather helps me with clearing the gutters. My grandmother still reminds me to always make sure I secure my windows at night, despite having a security system in place. They never mention my parents unless I bring them up, which is something I seldom do. One Friday, while we lounged on the porch swing, Helen Archer said, "Your mother's still telling everyone you abandoned Sandra." I kept quiet. Aunt Mary told her to quit bringing it up during family events, saying, "Nobody wants to listen to it anymore." That comment actually made me happy. I'm not oblivious to reality. I realize they still believe I failed some unstated loyalty test, that I should have taken responsibility even if it meant sacrificing my own achievements. But I'm certain of one thing. I rest more peacefully these days. From what I've been told, my older sister still lives at home and rents out the old house to pay for the mortgage. My nephews keep getting bigger. It's now been more than a year since I last saw them. Every now and then, I find myself curious about what information might have reached them. Sometimes I wonder if they'll ever try to contact me, though I no longer expect it. There are certain connections that don't require an explanation. Some bonds aren't meant to be repaired. Now and then, I experience a pang of longing for what might have been. If only they had ever recognized me as something more than a backup plan. If only their affection had been unconditional. Yet I don't wish I had chosen differently. That's no longer true for me. I've realized that peace is something I must claim for myself.